Howdy, this is Dr. Stacy Lyle. This is Module 5 of Geography 662. In this module, we'll be discussing the transfer of title or rights to land or minerals. Before you go through this module, I suggest you take the quiz. You could take it multiple times, but you want to take it and try to get an understanding of what you need to really pay attention to as you go through it. The outcomes of this is that you'll be able to explain the process of land transfer, which includes warranty deeds, special warranty deeds, easements, leases, will and trust, probate, court rulings, ownership of adjudication, limitation of title, adverse possession, quit claim, quiet title, color of title, deed of quittance, cloud of title, mechanics liens, patents, and or joint ownership agreements. And you'll utilize the rules of boundary construction to replicate ownership, weighing the original footsteps of the scriveners or surveyors that try to describe the agreement. You'll look at the four corners rule, what that means, and the intent of a document. The junior senior rights, we'll talk about contract law, race to the courthouse, simultaneous conveyance or subdivisions, the trespass to try title issues, and we'll have a strong understanding of the legal process of describing land and determining ownership by applying the dignities of call and boundary descriptions. In the course modules, you'll see under the course ebook, there's several books here that are given that are the Emmanuel series on legal processes. Because land transfer is a legal process, having a good understanding of the legality of court processes, corporations, contracts, properties, civil procedures, evidence, and tort is very important. So I suggest you read these. I'll have some of these in our quizzes. They're fairly easy to quickly read and go through. Okay, so let's start by originally looking at minimum standards. So boards of professional land surveyors put out minimum standards that you must follow when you are doing surveying and mapping type work. You'll see that there's several types of minimum standards that are out there. Here's one from the United States Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, that talks about when you're surveying an oil and gas areas and you're trying to do a plat that describes that property, what you have to do. So when you do a permit plat in the state of Colorado and just about every state in the United States except Texas, they must be stamped inside by a professional land surveyor. In the state of Texas, actually the oil and gas producers can stamp their own plats that they turn in. But they go through and describe, what you must need to do, and you need to have location directions to the nearest two sectional lines as a minimum in the land survey. So when you have a well, you have to tie it down and you need to provide the information to them. So they go through and give you some key information, not a lot there for the minimum standards in terms of how you operate. There are a lot of other minimum standards that are out there. The most common one is the Alta ACSM. This is the one that we use mainly for transfer of surface title properties, other than the state requirements that says how you go about trying to survey, map, and describe that property. Key things to look inside these minimum standards is one is how accurate do they need to be. So one of the things is that you have to have something called the minimum or the relative accuracy. For any measurement technology procedure used by the Alta ACSM in land title survey, the survey shall use appropriate trained personnel, competence with systematic errors, including those associated with instrument calibrations. So they want to make sure that you know what you're doing, your equipment is up to date, and that you use the appropriate error propagation and measurement design theory. So what they're saying here is that you need to have an understanding of the statistical concepts of reducing errors in your measurements to make sure that you get the best accuracy. But how accurate does everything need to be? So basically what it is that you need to have at least 2 centimeters or 7/100 of a foot, meaning that any point to any other point on your plat or deed must be accurate to each other within 0.07 feet plus 50 parts per million. Okay, the 50 parts per million says if you go 50 million meters, you can be a meter out. Okay, so that's what 50 parts per million, or excuse me, if you go a million meters, you can be 50 meters out for the 50 parts per million. So it gives you a lot of, you'd have to go quite a bit to see that. But if you have very large plats or maps, it just says that there could be some inaccuracies in those. So when you go through and do it, you got to look at most of your measurements is 0.07 feet. And this is important because I think all land GIS should be to that accuracy. If it was originally surveyed and we have those sets of documents, again, we should be able to reach inside those documents, get those actually polygons, polylines, points that represent that boundary, and put it to that accuracy that we need. But let's jump back to my summary of things. So you have precisions if you describe corporate limits. In the state of Texas, we use a 1 in 7,000 plus a tenth if you're actually inside a ETJ or inside of a city. If you're in a rural area, excuse me, if you're in the corporate city limits, which means you're in a big city, it's 1 in 10,000 plus a tenth of a foot. 1 in 7,000 plus a tenth of a foot. I mean, if you go 10,000 feet, you have a foot that you can be out plus a tenth. If you go 7,500, you could be a foot plus a tenth. But inside a city such as Dallas or Houston, you're not gonna go 10,000 feet. That's almost 2 miles, all right? So that's very large. In the rural areas, you will go that, but in here you can go for every 5,000 feet you go, you could be a foot out. So you have a lot of inaccuracies that you'll see in these surveys that you're allotted to. The equipment and the measurements that we do today are not really that inaccurate, but it could be that our decisions where to put it could force us to utilize those inaccuracies. Now, when you are putting what the area is, you need to put what to the precision of the significant numbers capable of achieving. So you look at these precisions for the areas, and although the measurements outweigh the area in a deed description, which I'll talk about later, it is important that you have a value that's there. So again, they say that you need to have equipment that is modern, up to date, and pay attention to potential errors. Now, in boundary construction, when delineating a property as an integral part of a survey, you must respect junior-senior rights. And I'll talk about that, what that means. But basically, if you have, say, 640 acres and you give away 160 of your 640, who is the junior and who is the senior? Well, obviously you should construct the 640 first, then the 160 that you're giving away, which you would think is your junior, must get their 160. And they actually elevate to a senior status. If you didn't have 640 and you meant to give a quarter 160, you still must give the 160. Now, when you say follow steps of the original surveyor, this is what's considered the four-corner rule, or what they did is what you must follow, not what they intended to do. The intent of a document is a legal term, or the intent of the property is what's in the four corners of that document, not what was in their head. Did they intend to give a quarter, or did they intend to give 160? The intent is what they did, not what they intended to do. Their intent should be within the four corners. And then you follow the dignity of calls when you try to replicate the property. And I'll talk about that. But basically what that is saying which evidence is the most important as you go through it. You need to look at the appropriate deeds or documents, including those of the adjoining parcels, but be careful about using the adjoiner parcels. The adjoiners might not be senior to you. Even if they call for them in your document, they cannot sometimes elevate above you and you suffer because of a junior. It actually becomes the year that they were given away from the sovereign. They are guaranteed their portion. So if you have, again, the 640 acres and you give away 160 and 160 and 160 and 160, so you've given away the 4 160s of the 640, a quarter of every one of them, and you find out that you didn't have 640. Well, who gets what in that scenario? Again, junior and senior rights, the first person would get their 160, the second, the third, and the fourth basically could get just the remainder. All right, so you need to have measurements in there that describe the property, that have all the values of the bearing and the distance, the bearing giving the direction and the distance along that area, and then you'll have calls to monuments. So when you have these monuments found out here, such as these iron rods found, and you have this bearing and distance, which is most important? If I go to that rod, go that bearing and go that distance, and I go past that rod or I fall short of that rod, which holds? It would be the rod, not the distance or the bearing. In some states, we would hold the distance if we didn't find that rod. In the state of Texas, we hold the bearing. The public land states of the BLM hold the distance over the direction, where the direction is held in the state of Texas. But if we find those corners and it calls for iron pins and we find those iron pins, we get what we get. Even if it's less acreage or it's more acreage, we would still get what we get. Okay, so when you're researching and trying to determine, okay, who owns what, you have that original document and you must survey from that original document. Wrong or right, if you find errors in that document that maybe gave too much land or forgot to give some land, should you try to fix it? Well, you could try to fix it. You take on that burden, but basically it is what they bought. They might have bought something that has what's called gaps or gores into other people's property, and it causes an issue. All right, so you need to do all the research, you need to get all that information where a GIS becomes very helpful, and then you need to describe the boundary use, where the physical monuments related to the coordinates of record dignity hold over all measurements. That includes the bearings, the distances, and the areas. So if I purchased a lease for 640 acres and I go out there and it goes from an axle to an axle to an axle to an axle like we had in our previous example, did they have extra acreage if we found 648, or did they get what they were supposed to get? If the physical monuments called and found for are there, they got what they were supposed to get. Did they get 648? Or did they get 640 and they got 8 extra acreage that the state might have an interest in? In this scenario, they would have the 8 acres. They would own them if I find the 4 monuments, because monuments rule over anything. So those have the biggest portion. So when you put your stamp or you certify something on there, you have to do what's called the standards of practice, and you're held to those. And when you're trying to retrace what they did, you look at the standards of practice. What would everyone else in that scenario do? Do they understand the applications of the rules of dignities of calls? And this becomes a very legal aspect of things to do. Put preliminary on there if you haven't decided on some plats is very good, but you'll see some that are recorded that has that. A lot of times there's a plat or a description or a report. A plat having a plat, a description, a legal description or a report. These are all considered the same in most states and have the same value. Is a plat better than a legal description? Is a report where a surveyor tried to explain the problems that are here better than the deed? It's really what is signed for in the agreement. If the agreement in the legal description calls for the plat, the plat can be brought forward, read in the same light, but it cannot be elevated above what's in the legal description, because that's what the landowners and the the leaseor and the leasee, or the grantor and the grantee agreed upon, and you must go by that. So you're supposed to leave behind proper monumentation, but that's not always the case, and sometimes the monumentation could be calling to an adjoiner's corner. So an adjoiner's corner, when it's called for, is important, but it cannot elevate the adjoiner above you if they are not senior, and I'll talk about that later on. The plat should be at a convenient scale, and then you're supposed to show any discrepancies. All right, if the deed was prepared from the plat, then the survey is not prepared. The surveyor is supposed to inform their client of any errors that they find, because usually you'll be able to see any errors that you might find on a plat because you can give more information. But in the deed, it might not have all that information there. So you need to make sure that when you have a deed, there might be other things. You should look for a surveyor's report. So is a plat required? No, it's not. You can just have a description, or what's called a legal description. And the courses shall be referenced upon that plat, and they need to tell you where they're going. Are they going north? Which north? There's magnetic north, true north, or geodetic north. Okay, so you got to know which north they used, and a lot of times in our legal descriptions we don't have that. A plat is required to have information about the surveyor, and it could say whether they found the monuments or they placed them in place. All right, so if a plat reference, it should cite on the minutes who is the document you are thinking you are reproducing. It might not be the current owner, but it might be the one you think is the right description of that property. Okay, and then you might have reference to the deeds of the property around you, so that you can then replicate that and see if there's anybody's deed that's trespassing on your deed. And then you should always look for multiple parts from that aspect of things. Now, surveyors can stamp and seal other things, like I explained, such as the legal oil and gas aspect. So that becomes important that we know that they can put those out there. Monuments should be marked. Monuments should be referenced to those. And basically, land surveyors cannot trespass on property. But if we knew where the property corner was, you wouldn't have us out there surveying it. So that's important to know. Now let's go and look at boundary construction. And we're going to talk about boundary construction and how to form these boundaries and determine what it is. But before we do that, I really want to go through and talk about deeds. So when transferring title from one person to the next, you must be in writing. That is the statute of fraud. So in other words, if I tell you that I am going to sell you 10 acres of my 160 acres, that contract would be a fraudulent contract, because you don't know what 10 acres of my 150 acres we're talking about here. I have referenced a court case that I'll ask you to read, where I worked on a federal court case in a bench trial. I testified, could you use a GIS as a land description? That's a good thought. What the key thing in a land description is that there must be a nucleus of enough description to determine what you own. What do you mean by that? Well, to begin with, you could have someone grant you or sell you lots or blocks out of a subdivision. Okay, so the grantor sells lots or blocks, block 5 of the Oak Hill, so here's block 4. Okay, which did they have here? So you need to make sure that you can describe that property in the most portions of what's called aliquot parts, which means blots or lots or sections or townships are legal descriptions, and those are the most important. Now, if I just told you lot 4 of blocks 5 of the Oak Hill subdivision, would you be able to go out and locate where that's at? No, you wouldn't. You would really need to go get the Oak Hill subdivision layout and see what that looks like. But that is an adequate enough, a nucleus of enough description to transfer title. Properties in subdivisions around the United States are sold daily using aliquot parts, or just lot and block, or sections or quarter sections from that standpoint. So you go from the general to the specifics, where the general holds over the specifics. What did they get? They got lot 4 of that block. Now you could describe lot 4 in more detail, but whatever they got lot 4. All right? So the deed must be in writing, and the deed is a legal document. And it goes through the deeds in the different phases of the deeds, and it describes the persons who are selling or granting, and the or the grantor, and then the persons who are receiving, the grantee, all right, or the leaseor or the leasee in oil and gas quite a bit. It must have those two parties, all right? So it must be given and it must be received, all right? And the deed must be described what is being given, or the gift, all right? And then it must say what they're given. Nowadays, they usually put $1 and other considerations because they don't want you to know what the number sign is for land speculations. But in the past, they sometimes would call out the value. Now, this is considered fee simple. Simply that you have two parties that transfer, a grantor that is the giver, a grantor that gives, okay? Or the grantee who receives. And words previously necessary at common law to transfer fees, simple estates are not necessary. So we used to have very complex words describing who the persons were, and that was important to know. So a transfer, either a deed or a lease, must be in writing. It must have the name of the grantor and grantee. It must describe the property. The words of conveyance must there. I bargain, I give, I sell, okay? Not words like we are agreeing upon. That is not a word of conveyance. You actually have to have some words of conveyance. The grantor must sign the document, all right? It must deliver to the grantee, and the grantee must receive the land. Now this becomes important because, wait a minute, what do you mean they receive it? Did they just get the document? No, they must sign it and have who they truly are and a way to find them with their address. Sometimes people will give land to the university and try to deed land to the university that has environmental concerns, and all of a sudden we know, oh, we own this land. Well, they gave it to us, but we didn't accept it. We must accept it for it to really be ours, and that becomes important. So in the warranty deed, and a warranty deed is that you're going to warranty a title, meaning that I own it and I will defend the fact that I own it. I'm not defending the fact of what I own, I'm just owning the fact that I own it. I say I'm selling you 640, I don't warrant 640, I own that I warrant. It being 640 acres plus or minus is a different thing. So you have the preamble that is here, and the preamble describes the party, who is the grantor, who is the grantee, what they are giving for consideration of $10 and other valuable consideration paid in cash by these individuals, the receipt of sufficient which is acknowledged, all right, which no lien is retained, either express or implied, have granted, sold, or conveyed. There's the key words that must be there. These presents do grant, sell, and convey unto Tom and Jim equal shares, all right, equal shares. This becomes important because they own that person owns 50% and that person owns 50%, but that means undivided everywhere, okay? Equal shares, that's what the equal shares, undivided, keywords to know, and that is key in this contract because this deed is really a contract, all right? And it's, what are they getting? All that certain tract of land within the Carlos Martinez grant. That's the general. It must be in that grant. It must be abstract number 6. It must be in Karnes County, Texas. And furthermore, the portion of that contains 55 acres. Now, that 55 acres portion, although it's up front here, it is the lowest dignity of call, as we call it. okay? And then it says more things about it. It references other documents. It says, you know, also shown in a survey appearing in the records in volume 16 and page 18 of the deed of records of Karnes County. Now, what about that document? What can be said about that document? That's like the Oak subdivision. I might need that document to understand what I'm truly getting, but that document cannot necessarily rise above. So you take this by the four corners and you read it in the light. And if there is another document, you can bring it forward and read it in the same light, but it can never ascend above this document. It can only help to improve or to clarify any ambiguity in here, all right? But what you get is inscribed in here. And then they go and give some bearings and distances going around this entire tract, all right? And they even say they call for a deed here from another person. In 1981, they call for their corners. So when they call for their corners and they call for, say, a monument being that corner, which is most important? That it's that corner or it's that monument? If you find the monument, it's the monument. It's not that they called for the corner. So they go a distance of so many feet to a post set. So the post set is the most important thing seen here. Insane being the westernly corner of this tract, being the original northwest line of said 55 acres. But the post set, even if it was set in the wrong location, it will go over the fact that it was supposed to be the original west line. Now, if you went and put the original west line and you found it was not where the post was set, unfortunately, it is now where the post is set. There is a statute about, well, how long does that post need to be set there? Because at this point, if this post is set in the wrong location, this title, and this is the document that is considered the title, has color. It is not clear. It has some ambiguities, or it has some latent ambiguities that might show up later on. We find it's not set in the right place on the face of it, and it becomes an issue. But let's say I build a house over my property, you know, so I have a little square here, and it was this post that was set, let's say it was the northwest corner up here, but I built something right in that corner, but the original property was supposed to be somewhere, or let's go back. This is the property, I set it right there, but the original property was supposed to be something like this. If I set it right at that corner, I would have an issue there, okay? Now you get down and it says save and accept any reserves or favors, any other things. Here you can see royalty minerals. They have undivided 1/2 interest in those more interests. And then they'll probably have an error and they'll say more or less. So the instrument of conveyance, also called a deed, all right, there are certain titles in states that describe what that is. There's some certain standards that individuals use, but it's pretty open to what it is. So which is more important when you have that deed and plat? It is assumed that the deed is derived from the plat, but the problem is the deed not necessarily have, or the transfer of title might not have the plat attached, only referenced. In that case, the deed resides. Okay, so is there a plat required? Not typically. Here you can see a piece of property. This is property that I had purchased, and it has the meets and bounds description of that property. Here's the bearings and information over here, but it really is not this that I bought. I bought lot 24 of lot 2. That's the deed that my deed reads, and it doesn't call for this plat. Although I have this plat, it is that description that rules over that. Now, it's important to understand, you know, do you have to have these deeds recorded in the subdivision? All right, I mean, in a courthouse, do I need to take a deed and record it in the courthouse for it to be legal? No, any document signed and agreed upon by individuals, recorded or not, is a legal document. But there are some laws that say if you subdivide land, if you make it smaller and smaller, some counties require that you must record those deeds. But if you're not subdividing land, you don't have to record that deed. It is not required. Subdivisions could be full-on subdivisions like we think of subdivisions, or me just splitting two pieces or cutting some piece out of my larger piece is considered a subdivision.